It's on.
Well, good evening, everyone. If you'd like to have a seat, we'll get going. And welcome to you all to the Effective Living Centre, to you folks gathered here live in the flesh tonight, and also folks watching via live stream or watching the recording of the session later on. Let's start the evening with an acknowledgement of First Peoples. We acknowledge the sovereign First Peoples of the land where we gather to worship, the Kaurna people. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to all descendants of this nation who have cared for this place since creation. We hope and act for reconciliation in this land. Amen. So tonight at the Effective Living Centre, we have a briefing on the Uniting Church in SA Synod Climate Action Plan, which was developed by the Environmental Action Group. That's the EAG's banner just over there. It's one of the task groups of the Effective Living Centre, and the Climate Action Plan developed by EAG was adopted by the Uniting Church SA Synod in 2022. Is that right, David?
The decision to aim for zero carbon in 2040.
Yes. Okay, good. Now, David's going to tell us all about the whole thing shortly, but the watchword of the Environmental Action Group is caring for God's creation is our core business. The aim of the Climate Action Plan is for the Uniting Church in SA to reduce emissions by 5% with a view to achieving 5% per annum with a view to achieving net zero emissions by 2040. Now, our main speaker tonight is the one and only David Shepherd, and we'll also hear later from Peter Ward. David is the convener of the Environmental Action Group, a highly respected telecommunications engineer in a previous life, a long-time climate activist and a member here at Christchurch Uniting. Peter is also a member of Christchurch, and as he told me a moment ago, he was an IT specialist in his former life. And Peter is very concerned about climate change and is committed to taking responsibility for the damage we are doing to the earth, and he's very knowledgeable about what we can do. So we're going to hear from David first in a minute, and from Peter later. Now, before I welcome David to the microphone, just some housekeeping. Mobile phones on silent, please. The toilets, they're just in the foyer and out to either side, men's and ladies. And after David and Peter's presentation, there'll be a Q&A session. We'll bring the roving mic around for you to ask questions. Please be brief, so as many people as possible have an opportunity to ask questions, and speak clearly into the mic, especially for the benefit of our live streamers. And we'd love you also after that to stay for supper. So, without further ado, let's welcome David Shepherd to the microphone. There's your clicker.
Thanks, Fergus. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is the first time that a plan of any kind really has been publicly discussed, or will be publicly discussed, to reach zero carbon in the Uniting Church. So it's not a blueprint, it's a set of propositions, ideas, and a way forward, backed by information, but still it's open for change, and it requires each individual congregation to pick up the cudgels and, in effect, establish their own way of doing this. I want to talk a little bit about the justification, first of all, for aiming for carbon zero and what the state of the world at the moment and what the world is doing to combat the situation we find ourselves in. So first of all, let's look at, I hope I press the right button here, but here it is. Yes, this is a graph which on the baseline here is the level, there's the average temperatures, world average temperatures before industrialisation. So if we go back in time before 1940 to say 1900, the baseline, it was stable. There was generally a fairly stable set of temperatures across the world. But with the widespread use of fossil fuels and increasing consumption of fossil fuels, carbon in the atmosphere has risen, and this has been the result that temperatures have increased by about 1.5 degrees centigrade. The problem is that it looks now like 2024 will be even warmer than 2023. So because we keep burning fossil fuels, the temperature will continue to rise. So something has to be done about it. Whoops, wrong way. This shows a much longer timescale, like 1 million years, how carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has fluctuated. So over a long period, it has cycles of going up and going down, but it's been a fairly consistent pattern over hundreds of thousands of years, so that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been fairly stable, but it changes with things like volcanic eruptions and weather events from time to time, but it's basically stable until we reach the modern era, starting at 1950, and all of a sudden it's shot up, and that is because of the burning of fossil fuels. So we can see that it's increased by more than 50% in that very short period since 1950. Oh, wrong way. I'm pressing the right buttons, but nothing's happening. So what is the world doing about climate change? In 2015, there was a famous meeting in Paris of the 200 countries to discuss commitments to control the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. And it was agreed that we would attempt to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And Australia is a signatory to that agreement. At this stage, we need it in order to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we have to reach net zero across the world by 2050. That's a huge ask, and countries have made commitments which hopefully would help us to achieve that. Unfortunately, the reality has not matched the promise, and we are far behind what we need to do And in fact, Australia's emissions are continuing to rise, and we had 467 million tonnes of carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere in June 23, which was an increase of 4 million tonnes on the previous year. So although we had committed to stabilise things, we haven't been able to do it. The biggest emitter in the world is China, which surprised me because, in fact, I thought the US would be, but China has emissions at least 50% higher than the USA. But in their case, they're making massive investments in renewables, and they have a fault now. Their economy is slowed down, and they will record a reduction for the year. So we can't pat ourselves on the back. Australia has not pulled its weight, and we should be pressuring our government to make decisions which will enable the country to achieve that promise. So I'd like to turn to the Uniting Church now. What's the Uniting Church's position on climate change? This is a statement which the Church has put out, which is a statement of intent. Our vision. We seek the flourishing of the whole of God's creation and all its creatures. We act to renew the earth from the damage done and stand in solidarity with people most impacted by human-induced climate change. Government, churches, businesses and the wider community work together for a sustainable future. I think mostly of Pacific nations when I read this, because they are in a far more vulnerable position than we are and could be obliterated by our neglect. So the Church has committed to our mission, acting to make this vision a reality. We will work with all parts of the Uniting Church to reduce emissions by 5% per annum and aim to become a net zero emissions church by 2040. There's another rider to this, how this was a decision made at the 2022 Synod meeting of South Australia, where it was agreed unanimously that we should aim for net zero by 2040. We've had a subsequent request from the Synod Standing Committee that the Environmental Action Group should play a leading role and be a particular force within the Synod Climate Action Working Group. So that's why we are here today and why we've put some thought into how we might achieve the goal of zero emissions by 2040. To start the ball rolling, we've set off an action plan where 5 volunteering congregations measured their current carbon footprint. And that's been quite a difficult exercise, and we've had some interesting learnings from that. The major contributor to emissions, if I just move on to the next one, the major contributor to emissions has been travel for most of the congregations, or all the congregations for which we have results. So it's travel to and from church activities and involved with church activities, which is the major contributor. In this particular, I'll show you some figures for this particular church in the next slide, which will give you an idea of the degree in which travel is important. Another significant contributor is the use of the building, of course. So we have power costs and lighting costs and so forth in buildings, and maintenance of the buildings. We found, even with the pilot congregations, that there was often a reluctance to get involved, even to the point of not wanting to provide data to the people who were running the program because of a sense that perhaps this is not what the church should be on about. Perhaps it's too far down. 2040 is a long way down the track, and we have other matters which are more pressing to us. And I think also there's a fear that it's going to cost a lot of money. And in looking at the whole thing, I question some of these concerns, but they are real concerns, and we have to take notice of them and take into account how people feel about the whole thing. This is the figures for Christchurch. We're a modest 6.8 tonnes per annum. Even that in tonnes of carbon dioxide seems quite a lot. And travel was 5.16 which is about 80% or thereabouts of our emissions. So travel, use of cars is a particular area of concern and will not just go away because of technology, well, not quickly go away because of technological changes. So I'd like to talk now about, first of all, what we can do to mitigate the main contributors to our carbon footprint. There are the two ones I would like to focus on would be the building costs and travel costs. So we'll talk a little bit about building costs, first of all. The good news here is that the South Australian government and successive governments, not being partisan in this regard, have decided that South Australia will be will be powered by renewables by 100% by 2027, which is only 2 years away. This is a remarkable achievement when it comes to be, and all the pieces are going into place to enable this to happen, which means that the lighting costs, for example, tonight, and the heating costs will not cause carbon emissions. Nevertheless, I think it's important that that congregations look at minimising or becoming independent as far as power costs are concerned. For one thing, there's a financial gain if it's justified to install solar in your church or battery. If it's economically justified, you will save money in the long run. That's point one. Point two would be that this money can be used for whatever the congregation wants to use it for, but could be used for offsets. That there is other, as time goes by, we won't be able to get rid of all emissions simply by the passage of time, and we can use that money, if necessary, to buy offsets. So I would suggest that there are gains for churches to provide or to do an economic analysis of their needs in terms of what would be a benefit to them for power costs and other things, to see if it's going to save money to install solar and or batteries. The costs are coming down quite dramatically, and we're not talking a huge amount of money in the longer term. This is the cost trends for solar over the last 10 years or so. You can see that it's come down per watt, from $2.5 per watt to $1 per watt. And it's kind of stalled in the last 3 years. The reason why it's stalled is that there's a particular component of solar systems called polysilicon, for which the price rose dramatically. It's nearly all produced in China. And while that happened, the price of solar didn't actually rose a bit. But now other sources have come through for polysilicon, and it is expected that the price per watt will continue to drop. So the strategy I would suggest, which we could adopt, first of all, if you're a congregation who has the job of minimising your emissions, conduct an audit to identify issues which can be improved. To include insulation and lighting. Over time, electrify all appliances. In other words, get rid of gas and get rid of internal combustion engines, which might be used for various applications, which will cut out those sources of carbon. Conduct an economic analysis to see if solar is justified on an economic basis and take action accordingly. If no action is justified, regularly review the analysis as prices and circumstances change. So that's a sort of a broad brush blueprint for what we could do to minimise carbon footprint from buildings. Now we turn to cars and transport. As far as cars are concerned, Australia is a standout for all the wrong reasons. The average consumption of petrol by cars now on the road in Australia is something like 10 litres per 100 kilometres, because there are so many big gas-guzzling vehicles out there. And we are far worse than most other countries in the world, except for Russia. Russia's the only other one that has no emissions controls. So we can. But if you bought a new car today, in 2024, the average emissions in Australia is 6.9 litres per 100 kilometres. If you compare that with other countries around the world, China 4.2, USA 4.2, and Europe 3.5. So when you talk about how many litres of fuel you will use, you can directly translate that to emissions, because it's all burnt and it all goes into the atmosphere. So we are not only contributing far more than necessary to the atmosphere in terms of carbon dioxide. We're also, we are costing ourselves. People are paying double for their cars, for their transport, compared to a country like Europe, for example. So it's not a good situation. Australia has now legislated to introduce emission controls from January 25. So those controls will come in, and I'd just like to read a little bit. This is a government bulletin, which you've got to make allowance for a bit of propaganda here, but it's factual, so it's pretty factual. The Australian Parliament passed a bill for new vehicle efficiency standards, which sets CO2 emission standards for Australia light-duty vehicles. These are emissions targets for passenger cars, SUVs, utilities and vans. It's a critical step forward in decarbonisation goals, and the standard will drive down CO2 emissions from passenger cars, including most SUVs, by about 17% per year, and from light commercial vehicles by about 12% per year up until 2029. So it will lead to a cumulative emissions reduction of 20 million tonnes through 2030 and 320 million tonnes through 2050. That's a huge reduction. It's just that it's kind of 10 years too late, probably, but it's on the right track. So if on top of that, it means that the vehicle manufacturers can only sell in Australia cars a net. They can sell gas guzzlers, but they've got to offset those gas guzzlers with efficient cars. So the total mix of cars that they sell have to meet the standard. Otherwise, they cost them a lot of money. So that's how it's going to work, but it'll take time to come in. So if we look then at a possible strategy for the Uniting Church in terms of travel costs, oh, wait a minute. No. If we do nothing, emissions are going to fall. And because of the introduction of new cars of better emissions standards, but we should encourage our members to take into account the emissions of their cars when they're thinking of buying a new car. It does make a difference. We will, by 2040, I think that we are still going to have petrol-powered cars. In Britain, for example, they are legislating to ban the production of internal combustion engines from 2030. So, and other countries are considering the same kind of legislation. All the cars that Australia buys are from overseas. So I think that this is probably an indicative pattern that the emissions of new cars will come down quite rapidly. By 2040, maybe we'll all be driving an emissionless car, but kind of doubt. I think we have to be prepared to pay or to work out offsets to compensate for emissions even as we approach 2040. So, offsets I'll leave for Peter, who's going to talk next. We'll be talking about offsets. He knows more about them than I do, and I'll leave it to him to do that. The next area, of course, is funding. I think we have to be concerned about that and it has to be achievable by churches who adopt such a plan. So we want to make it as easy as possible. The good thing about funding is that most costs that we spend will lead to a future cost gain or expenses gain. So if we can look at the long term, we'll be ahead in the future. For example, a solar system will actually, if you plan on to recover your outlay within 5 years, after 5 years you will be financially better off. And I think churches who have made the effort to install solar systems are seeing that in real terms. The trouble is that it's only the churches who've got the money who've got it. There are so many churches that haven't got the money, so they can't do it. And the good thing about that is that the costs are coming down, but not fast enough to allow many churches to lash out and buy a solar system. So how are we going to... I suggest that we should have a pool of funds which could be used on a rolling basis so that congregations can call on that pool, install their system, and then progressively pay back as their lower bills come in every month or 3 months or whatever it is. They pay a bit back into the pool so that it's a genuine rolling pool and not one that empties down to nothing. So I think the more well-to-do congregations will be able to do it on their own, but there are many congregations who just don't have those resources. Why support this project? This project, I think, is very important and very worthwhile for many reasons, and it's worth thinking about why we should support such a program. The first reason I've put up there is that the earth is not ours to make a mess of. It belongs to God, and as Christians, we honour and worship God by caring for the earth. So that's a compelling reason to be part of this program. We want to leave a healthy, habitable earth to our children. We love the earth and want to keep it safe. We have a responsibility to nature and other creatures. Our actions will demonstrate to the wider community where we stand and encourage others to do likewise. And finally, the cost is not out of reach. Most cost will bring a longer-term gain and lower costs in the long run. So we have to kind of make a big effort at the start to get things going, but in the long run, it won't cost an arm and a leg. I think just going back to cautious reactions from people involved with the initial pilot program, I don't think we are going to get a lot of the level of buy-in that we need just by having a net zero project. I think it has to be couched in the context of caring for the earth, that that is what we believe in. That is what motivates us to do that, to do this, and we should sell it to people who might get involved on that basis. So it's not just going for carbon zero, it's caring for the earth. And this means that we are not just doing the things to reduce our emissions, we're also doing things like recycling and getting rid of plastic and cleaning up our act in every way. So I would propose that that's the kind of basis that we would move forward on. That's all I want to say, except how can we go forward on this? First of all this information will be available to any congregation or any people who it's open. I'm going to put it on the Environmental Action website, so it's free and available to everybody. The members of our group would be very happy to talk to congregate or to people or from churches who are interested in this to explain or to answer questions or whatever it might be. But it'll have to be driven by the congregations themselves. It's not something that EAG can drive. It's up to each individual church to pick up the cudgels and make the decisions that they need to make in their own interests. There is a very small pool of funds available from the Environmental Action Group, and we would hope to augment that in some ways with public appeal in churches. So what our needs are is buy-in by people by church people, a pool of funds, and we'd love to have more expertise available to talk about this issue in a wide sense. There's going to be a synod meeting in, I think it's October, isn't it? And we are going to, the EAG is going to have a table there, and we hope that we can get interest from congregations through that display. So thanks very much for listening, and I'd like to hand over now to Peter, who knows a lot about offsets and takes very seriously our responsibility to have our own individual emissions in order or compensated for, so that we ourselves, and by our own way that we live, do not make the situation worse. So thank you for talking to us, Peter, and over to you.
So, I think most of you will remember Lucy from Peanuts and her classic pose. What about me? Don't my emissions count for something? Well, yes, your emissions do count for something. I made the mistake of talking to David about this and said, well, why are we setting the target of 2040 to be net zero? I've been net zero for 3 years. And I think that the problem is that there are two aspects to the commitment that Synod has made. It talks about reducing our emissions by 5% a year and being net zero by 2040. And it leads you to think that the one is causing the other. We're going to get to net zero by 2040 by reducing our emissions by 5% a year. They don't have to be in lockstep. And I'll be trying to show that they shouldn't be in lockstep. It is an extremely important goal to reduce our emissions, and doing it by 5% a year is a good target to aim at. But I would hope to show that we don't need to wait until 2040 to be net zero. There is just in terms of background, there's a disconnect in this conversation. The federal government is committed to Australia being net zero by 2050, according to, as per Paris. It's generous to say that they're committed. It would be more accurate to say they've been dragged kicking and screaming into it, into making statements that sound like they're committed. But let's be generous, and that's not the disconnect. The disconnect is that although they are committed, they don't actually do much emitting. So exactly what they're committed to, we need to tease out. The reason for that is that the emitting is done by a whole lot of entities or actors. There are about 1,300 federal government entities, so they do some emitting. That is the federal government's emissions are generated by 1,300 federal government entities. There are, though, about 10,000 state and local government entities doing their emitting. Then there are 600,000 not-for-profits, one of which is Waiver Uniting, one of which is the State Assembly, Uniting Church Assembly. There are 2.5 million businesses, large and small, and then there are something like 27 million of us. So round that up, there are about 30 million emitters of different shapes and sizes, some of whom happen to be federal government emitters. The way forward is not government policy, particularly not in Australia, because we're not going to get strong policy leadership from either side of politics. Here, the government, at best, sees itself as a cheerleader and exhorting those 30 million emitters to do the right thing. That's at best. I'm not going to talk about at worst. And here's the latest bit of cheerleading. This came out, I think, last week. The Sector Pathways Review, a federal government document. It's a pretty good summary of the various strategies that may be adopted by the various sectors of the economy in moving towards being carbon net zero, or carbon neutral, I like to call it. It's perhaps interesting information for the movers and shakers in those sectors of the economy. To be honest, they've probably been struggling with these ideas for the last 10 to 15 years. But there's not much in this for us, in this document. Although I think it's aimed at us. The information is not important for us. I think this is aimed politically at us so that the government can say, look, we're serious about your responsibility. So that's cheerleading. The way forward is also not some new technology. There are good technologies out there for reducing emissions. and they will get better. That's what we do. But there is no silver bullet from a technological point of view for solving this problem. One of the best bits in that review report that came out last week that I think is addressed at us is this quote. Waiting for new, better, cheaper technologies is tantamount to choosing to continue to emit. And if I can paraphrase that in the context that we've had explained to us tonight, caring for God's creation, the damage to the environment caused by my emissions today is my responsibility today. It's not somebody else's responsibility. It's not the government's responsibility. It's my responsibility to do something about my emissions today. Not to wait for some silver bullet technology in 15 years that will actually mean that I can do what I like and be carbon zero. Okay? That'll be 15 years of emissions that have kept going into the atmosphere from my activity while I wait. I can't wait. So, what is the way forward? Each of those 30 million emitters in Australia must reduce what emissions they can and offset what they can't. That's it. That's not the executive summary, that's the whole thing. Keep reducing what you can and offset what you can't. So in terms of individuals reducing what we can, what does that look like? Well, it might mean buying an electric car. It might mean, if your lifestyle permits it, walking a lot more or riding a bike. Not sure whether I could ride a bike still, but be interesting to try, but not where I live, which is in Nairn. Using public transport. Might be installing solar panels, as David was talking about. It might mean switching to carbon neutral suppliers. And I don't just mean electricity there, I mean your insurance provider. Might be able to find a green one. Who you get legal advice from, where you buy your coffee beans. There are increasing numbers of companies who are promoting the fact that they have gone carbon neutral. When I ran a forum on this a couple of years ago, at that stage I found 300, and they were lawyers, they were insurance companies. There was an IGA in Murray Bridge that has decided to be carbon neutral. It's a long way to go to do your shopping, but you know, there may be such supermarkets down here now, and we may be able to increasingly prod them and say, why aren't you? As more of these organisations become carbon neutral. So reduce what you can, and then What's involved in offsetting what's left? Well, the first thing is find an easy carbon footprint calculator. They're not all intuitive in my experience, but some of them are. Find an easy one. Calculate your footprint. This is an annual process. This isn't something you do once, pay the money, and then you clean, right? You do it every year. And the good thing about these technologies that are coming on stream is that our footprint is likely to reduce each year as various suppliers of the goods and services we consume go green, our footprint will go down. So that's why you can calculate it each year. Then pick a reputable supplier of certified offsets and purchase your offsets annually. A worked example. This is my example. I don't have an electric car. One, because I can't afford one, and two, because I don't have cheap electricity. Most people that I speak to who have electric cars have solar panels on their roof and they get cheap electricity, or they plug it in when they get to work and it's free. And good luck to them. But I can't do that. I have a small hybrid car on order, and that will reduce my fuel consumption by about 50%, which will therefore reduce my travel footprint. I use some public transport. I've got out of the habit of it over the last 6 months while I was involved in a few things that seemed to take over my life. So I'm trying to get back into using more public transport. Solar panels. I can't put solar panels on my roof because I have too many trees around my house. So I have paid for many years now a surcharge on my electricity for it to be deep green. So there's a commitment that Origin makes to supply me with renewably sourced electricity. I'm starting to think about whether I stop doing that because I have a suspicion that Origin is simply doing that to make money because they're probably sourcing most of their electricity renewably anyway, and mugs like me who tick this box are paying more for something that I don't have to pay for. I haven't worked that one out yet, but at the moment I accept that this is the way that I can get green electricity. So I calculated my household footprint as 16 tonnes for the year. I'm happy with the offset supplier Carbon Neutral Australia. They seem to me to be reputable. It's not my recommendation that you should rush off and use them. There are lots of reputable suppliers of offsets in Australia. That's the one that I happen to like when I browsed through the offerings. Currently, they are providing offsets from $4.40 a tonne through to about $40 a tonne. I was staggered when I went to get my offsets this year to see $4.40. And therefore, well, let's just look at why the huge range. It depends on whether you are wanting to achieve secondary or tertiary benefits with the offset project. At the $4.40 end, what you're doing is, I think that one is funding a solar farm in India. and its offset, its certified offset, is that it is replacing fossil fuel use in India for that electricity. So it is purely offset. It doesn't provide any other benefit. At the expensive end, the $40 a tonne end is an Australian revegetation project. So it's expensive because it's in Australia, and all of the costs are expensive, but it is providing biodiversity. It's revegetation for habitat. And it happens to also lock up carbon. So it's the carbon offset is, if you like, not the primary benefit of that project. And so that's why there's a range. And in fact, this year, for budget reasons, I've gone for mostly at the lower end of their range. And so my offset cost was $124 this year, down from $320 last year. So that's offsetting my 16 tonnes this year. And I put it to you that that is not a lot of money. If the footprint for Wayville Uniting is about six tonnes, and I have a question for question time about the electricity component of that, but if it is 6 tonnes this year, and if we decided we would only spend at the lower end of it, that's $25. I wouldn't think that was worth convening a meeting of whatever is the group that approves expenditure, right? And if it was at the top end of it, it's still only $240. So that's, I leave that thought with you. So that's my experience. Thank you.
Now it's question time, so perhaps if David and Peter stay up there to field questions when they come, and I'll bring round the microphone to anybody who wants to ask a question. So who wants to go first?
Peter, just while we're talking about offsets, how do we go about understanding how sustained the offset is? In other words, they may plant a tree, but if the tree dies, are they committed to replace the tree? And I ask that because I know that in WA, my brother at one stage was picking sandalwood, and part of the deal was for every dead sandalwood tree they picked, they had to plant a new one. But he said in the 20 years he was doing it, he never saw a new tree shoot. They planted the seed, but it didn't happen. I just wonder whether, how do we know that what you're doing is going to be sustained?
I think that's a really good question, and that kept me from going in for offsets for some time. The other thing that kept me from it was that for some years I was failing to get a PhD in modelling biosequestration of carbon, and I was sort of coming to terms with all the difficulties in modelling this stuff, estimating the amount that we're looking up, but I failed to get that PhD, and I got over the problem. I think that at the end of the day, we don't know. The best we can do is buy offsets from reputable suppliers and look at their projects, and the various projects that they will offer you say what standard they are accredited to. and go for the ones that are accredited against a high enough standard, right? That's why I mentioned to David, I think, recently, that just ticking the box, if you're going overseas and you tick a box to sort of reduce your guilt about the travel cost, to plant a tree to offset the carbon of the flight, you know, you don't know where that's gone. I mean, that can go anywhere. I think in a lot of cases, the trees don't even get planted, never mind get replaced. So I think all you can do is go for the highest quality accreditation, and keep reducing your emissions, right? It's still important to reduce your emissions because it's best to reduce less. But because we can't emit nothing, we've got to offset as well. So it's the best we can do.
Thank you very much. I'm in a very privileged position to say that we have just planted 1,004 trees on our farm. And I'm thinking, and these were done by volunteers, and the seed was grown by volunteers, and we do get grants for weeding. But I'm thinking about how this world was captivated by Clean Up Australia Day. And then the whole world adopted it. And I'm thinking, can't the Uniting Church start Come and Plant a Tree Day? And, you know, we do that and we invite churches with youth to come and plant trees and interview them. How does it feel to plant a tree? Have you ever planted a tree? Because I feel like we've got to walk and chew gum. We've got to do everything we can. And when we've got the kids in that wonderful position of planting a tree and they can come and measure it every year, they can come and bury their pet there. You know, those type of things. We can sort of really do a long-term investment into our kids and their real experiential sense of I care for the environment and we're doing it as a group. I was just wondering, because I really admire the work we're doing, but I'm looking at the age in the room, and I include myself in that, and I'm thinking we really have to work with our youth, and I just wonder what's your thoughts?
Are you going to just go and answer over there, Dave? No, to the microphone.
Sorry. I agree with what you're saying, Lily. I think that we have so many of our young people live very urban lives and their interests, they're very disconnected from nature. And I would love to see schools pay more attention to getting their kids out in nature and planting trees and walking in trees and all that sort of stuff. I think it has benefits which we don't appreciate until a lot longer afterwards.
Could I just add something to that, please? If I could just add something. I share your passion. I think it's wonderful. My late wife and I had a small farm, a hobby farm, in a very dry part of the state. We planted 6,000-7,000 trees. We bought this 40 acres completely bare, and we revegetated significantly. And the excitement of seeing the birds coming back, and then seeing nature producing grasses that we had no idea would come back. You know. Eniopogon nigricans, and then the diamond firetails came to feed on the Eniopogon, and it's a wonderful feeling. I think that's a terrific thing for us to do. And if we can encourage that in some organisational way, then that's fine. I think we need to be very careful that we don't confuse that with the carbon question, because to try to say, well, we can actually do our own carbon offsetting by doing some planting. We can't plant enough, and we can't measure it, and we can't guarantee it. You know, it's better to keep them separate. So they're two different things. Passionate about revegetation for biodiversity, and fortunately some of the projects that you can get involved in for offsetting are doing that as well on a very big scale. So yeah, let's do it in both ways.
Yeah, just following on from what Lily was talking about, that there is an organisation in South Australia that already does this, and I would see it, in fact, much better, rather than reinventing the wheel, to encourage churches to get involved with Trees for Life. Now, out at Morialta, we did that, and that achieved everything you said, but we didn't have to mess with organising it. There were a whole lot of expert people who'd been doing it, and you know, all you do is volunteer and go out and work with them, and that actually also has, I think it was one of the things I got out of it, was that I have a few farmers now who are my best buddies because I grew trees for them every year, and I was just as proud as they were when one of the ones on the Murray River, where it was just a rock face sort of going down to the river, it's now covered with beautiful native shrubs. And when I see it, I talk about it as mine. But could I make another comment about trying to encourage people? I read I thought a couple of interesting articles recently, and the authors were pointing out that we are programmed evolutionary to attack or be concerned about the thing that is most imminent or closest to us or about to happen. And they were sort of saying one of the things we have to try and get around is that people think about climate change as something, you know, in the distance, and we talk about it tonight, we're talking about 2040, 2050. There are, I would dare say, some in this room, including me, who aren't going to be around in then. So it's something, you know, so my question really is, how do we motivate people, given that perhaps we are programmed not to pick on things, you know, we're more likely to get concerned about something that's happening in the block behind our house than we are about something like climate change, because it... I would actually. Yeah. Can I talk to that? I think that's a really important question, because it explains why so little has been done. Because we go out there and everything seems all right. We can still see the sun, you know, trees are still growing, there are still birds, and so it doesn't seem to be a problem. But we have some of that evolutionary wiring, but we also have our intelligence, and we're able to look at those figures that David put up, and see that associated with this temperature rise, there has been this carbon dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere. Now, there are different ways of looking at that. There are problems with the climate modelling. We could talk for a week and a half about that, but you have to say that it doesn't seem to be smart that in 200 years
we have put back into the atmosphere about half of the carbon that was laid down as oil, gas and coal over millions upon millions of years, hundreds of millions of years ago. We've just put it straight back into the atmosphere in 200 years, half of it. We're about halfway through those reserves. And that just doesn't seem to be smart. It doesn't seem to be a smart way for us to use the resources of the planet. It's not good stewardship. So we can make that assessment even though the sun is still shining. And that's the way that I think we have to decide that we're going to do this. Not that it's not going to be my problem because I'm going to be dead, because I will be dead by 2050, certainly. But I look at this and say, those 16 tonnes that I know I put into the atmosphere this year are causing a problem to God's creation. And I can take them out of the atmosphere by buying these offsets. No brainer.
How do we get other people to, I mean, you and I said that, but
I think we just keep having the conversation.
the vast
And
majority of people don't seem to.
well, I think increasingly people are seeing it. I mean, the carbon offset suppliers are doing reasonably good business, and big organisations are getting into offsets. Some of these big Australian corporations are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year on offsets. A company doesn't spend a couple of $100 million on something that they don't think is important. All right, so we just have to keep having the conversation. As I think I said, did I say it? When the penny finally dropped for me and I decided to get into offsets and told a friend, he said, I've been trying to tell you that for years. You know, he'd been having these conversations and I hadn't got it. But eventually we do get it.
Peter, thanks for that contribution, because that comes with integrity. You're doing what you say, and I really appreciate that, and I think we as Christians must aim towards that more and more often. So thank you for that. I'm always suspicious, right from the very beginning, of carbon offsets, because there's a price attached to it. One is a dollar price, but there's also an invisible price, because everything is connected to everything else. Take, for example, Landline last week. The best dairy country in Australia is now going under millions and millions of trees for carbon offsets, and we will soon have to be importing milk by the looks of it. Now, everything has a cost, an invisible cost, unless you're looking really clearly. So I'm really suspicious of the whole thing. I went to look at what Qantas said they would offset carbon emissions by, down on Lake Alexandrina. There was, several years ago, an area planted which they claim is an offset, and it is disgusting. The population is about 30–40% of what was planted. Mm-hmm. Just awful. Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm very suspicious. And there are implications. What if we all decided we would do what you do? Now, I admire you've made the start, but what are the implications if I go and say, oh, no, I'm right, I pay $200 to offset it, and we get those carbon offsets working properly? What are the implications for food production globally? Because we cleared the land so that we could grow food. And we've been able to do that, but there's another invisible cost. What are the implications if we all start to do it, or vast numbers of us start to do it? That worries me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well,
Can I have a supplementary question as well? Yeah. Yeah, no, deal with that.
well, I think that that's a really good point. I think the only thing I ever tried to teach my kids was nothing's free. So I agree with that completely. And it appalls me if good farming land is being revegetated, because most of our good farming land has had houses built on it. And what's left we need to keep farming on. So yes, I agree with that. That's a problem. And if that's where it's being done, then that's atrocious. As I mentioned to this gentleman over here, things like the Qantas project, a lot of those projects were not well managed. You've got to pick projects that are being well managed. But it may be that that apart from some projects which are done for biodiversity reasons and are done in the right place, maybe most of the projects won't be tree planting. By no means all of the offset projects are tree planting projects, right? So this one that I've bought most of my offsets in this year is simply putting a solar farm in somewhere in India. One of the other projects this year is supplying some better way of supplying clean water in Uganda. Because it's an offset project, because the old approach that they had to getting clean water was going and burning as much wood as they can to boil the water. They now get that through some other process, and they therefore don't have to do that. The secondary benefit of that project is that the women were the ones who were doing that mostly, and they are now empowered through having more time available. Last year, same thing in another part of Africa. The project was rolling out improved cooking stoves, because previously they cooked on 3 stones and a piece of steel on the top of it, and spent all day foraging for wood, burning it in their hut, and having the smoke and all the health problems that went with that. And again, the women were the ones who were foraging for the wood. They've got these more efficient stoves with a flue that goes out so that the place doesn't fill with smoke. They burn a fraction of the wood that they were burning before, and the women have time available to do important, empowering things. You know, that's a different, that's a certified offset project, right? So by no means are they all planting trees, and they certainly shouldn't be planting trees on prime farming land. I agree with you. Supplementary, I think.
So we've got time for a couple more very quick questions.
Hi, Don Brown from Athelston Uniting. I've got an electrical history. Last 15 years I was in the electrical industry, just supplying one tiny part of equipment for substations and power stations, and I just loved working with the companies who were doing wind farms and solar farms, and we often contracted to consolidated power projects in the city, who used to be owned by South Africans, now owned by Americans, but they got most of the solar and wind projects in South Australia and indeed other states. It was just fantastically rewarding to be involved in so much. Notwithstanding the fact that everything is indeed connected to everything, and you always wondered about, are there long-term implications we haven't thought about? That's just by the by. However, despite an engineering background, I don't really understand in my head what is a tonne of carbon. I mean, I understand what 1,000 kilograms is, and a kilogram is 1,000 grams. I get that. And I know gas has weight just like a solid, etc. At work, they instigated a program trying to reduce the amount of paper we used. So the IT people would add up how many documents you'd sent to the printer during a month and how many trees or tons of trees you'd destroyed, but telling me once a month that I'd destroyed 700 kilograms worth of trees, well, what does that really mean in terms of, is that good? Is it bad? My colleague next door was a technician who had to supply a lot of paper documentation for all the projects he was managing. Well, he used twice as much as me, but it was really hard to grasp as a layperson in that area, what does it mean to use so many kilograms of timber or CO2? I've got to go back to Church Council and give them a bit of a synopsis of tonight, and I'm very proud of what the Environmental Action Group is doing and what I've heard tonight. It's fabulous. How do I tell somebody what is a tonne of carbon or tonne of, in real terms? It can be a bit hard to convey to people what that means. And it's a bit like when you hear very large numbers in finance or medicine. It's such a big number sometimes, you think, well, is that good? Is it, better than last year? People talk about all sorts of things in sometimes humongous numbers, but is it good or bad? It's a bit like saying, last year we did some projects and we saved 45,000 tonnes of carbon going into the atmosphere. Is that a lot? Is it a small amount? Just wondering how we can communicate those kinds of concepts.
Thank you. David, question for you.
Yes, I agree it's confusing, but I think that when we look at the total emissions of a country like Australia, 600 million tonnes per annum, we can get some sort of feel of, and the fact that we are 5 million tonnes more than we were last year, that's negative progress. We can be sure that we're not achieving a good result. I think it's the growth so we have to reduce, and I think the country level gives you some sort of feel of what the numbers mean. When we look, I looked at a graph of emissions from all the countries around the world. Australia is sort of down here compared with China. Up there, USA, up. So nevertheless, the figures are huge and daunting. We can only be responsible for ourselves.
So hold that thought, folks. Now, there's plenty of time for more discussion over supper. We want you to stay and have supper, a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. But let's now thank both David and Peter for their presentation tonight. So God bless you all. Let's have some supper, folks. Thank you.